They thought it was just a clumsy reconnaissance plane. Minutes later, the sky was on fire. No mayday calls, no escape. Japanese fighters fell in burning spirals toward the Pacific jungle below. That morning, a legend died, and a new predator, the P-38 Lightning, was born. December 27, 1942, the sky changes. The sun rose slowly over Port Moresby, turning the mist above New Guinea into burning gold. Beneath torn camouflage nets, ground crews moved fast, almost nervously, around a row of aircraft that didn't look like fighters at all. Twin tails, twin engines, long angular bodies that seemed more machine than airplane. To many, they looked awkward, too big, too strange to survive a real fight. Across the water, Japanese pilots were already airborne, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, men who had ruled the Pacific sky for more than a year. Their Zero fighters flew in tight, confident formations, engines humming with the certainty of dominance. This was supposed to be routine escort. The bombers swat aside, the defenders go home victorious. But high above the jungle canopy, something new waited in silence. When the order came, the twin-engine fighters rolled forward and clawed into the sky. Turbochargers screamed. Altitude came fast. And as the Japanese formations crossed below, unaware 12 American pilots tipped their noses down toward the sun. What followed would shatter every rule of air combat the Pacific had known. When the Zero ruled the sky. For more than a year before that morning, the Pacific had belonged to Japan. When the Mitsubishi Zero first appeared over China, then over Pearl Harbor, Allied pilots thought they were facing something unreal. The Zero didn't fight like an airplane, it danced. It turned tighter, climbed faster, and seemed to hang in the air where others stalled and died. One mistake, one instinctive turn, and an Allied fighter vanished in a flash of cannon fire. American pilots learned those lessons the hard way. Flying P-39s and P-40, they entered dogfights believing courage and skill would be enough. Instead, they found themselves trapped in tightening spirals, watching Zero fighters slide effortlessly onto their tails. Against the Japanese ace pilots, men trained for years in aerobatics and precision gunnery tradition meant slaughter. Losses mounted, squadrons were wiped out, confidence evaporated. This dominance wasn't luck, it was doctrine. Japanese air strategy was built on the idea of decisive battle. Their pilots weren't just trained to fly, they were sculpted into weapons. Every maneuver, every burst of fire was practiced until it became instinct. By late 1941, they were arguably the most dangerous fighter pilots on Earth. Across the ocean, the United States was still clinging to outdated beliefs. Fighters were seen as escorts, not hunters. Speed and altitude were undervalued. Turning fights were taught as proof of skill, not death sentences. And the price of that thinking was paid in burning wreckage across the Pacific. By mid-1942, the truth was unavoidable. If America kept fighting the Zero on its terms, it would lose the sky, and with it, the war. What was needed wasn't a better turn or braver pilots. What was needed was a machine and a mindset that refused to play by the old rules. And long before the first shots were fired over New Guinea, that answer had already begun to take shape on a drawing board in California. The fighter that refused to turn. In a quiet Lockheed design room in California, years before Pearl Harbor, the future of the Pacific Air War was taking shape long before anyone knew how desperately it would be needed. The sketches on the table, didn't look like fighters. Two engines, twin booms, a narrow cockpit pod hanging between them like a weapon suspended in midair. To many it looked wrong, too large, too complex. Some called it an experiment, others called it a mistake. But the men who drew it understood something others did not. If you couldn't outturn the Zero, you wouldn't try. If you couldn't beat it in a dance, you would strike like lightning. The new aircraft was designed to fight in a world above the dogfight. Two powerful engines meant speed the Japanese couldn't match. Turbo superchargers meant altitude where enemy fighters gasped for air. And instead of scattering guns across the wings, every weapon was placed in the nose, 4 heavy machine guns and a cannon firing as a single brutal voice. No convergence, no guesswork. When the pilot pulled the trigger, everything hit exactly where he aimed. This fighter wouldn't circle its enemy. It would stalk from above, dive with terrifying speed, fire once, then climb away untouched. It was a rejection of everything that had gotten American pilots killed. As the war exploded across the Pacific, this strange aircraft was rushed from theory to reality. Crates arrived at forward bases. Ground crews stared at its twin tails in disbelief. Pilots climbed into cockpits, unsure whether they'd been given salvation or a death trap. But training brought clarity. One rule above all others: never turn with the enemy. Altitude was survival. Speed was escape. Discipline was life. By the time the first squadrons reached New Guinea in late 1942, the Lightning was no longer an experiment. It was a challenge thrown directly at Japanese air doctrine. And on December 27th, when those twin-engine fighters rolled into the sky over Port Moresby, the Zero would face an enemy it had never prepared for, one that fought in 3 dimensions and refused to fight fair. Baptism of fire. The first missions weren't heroic, they were quiet. Too quiet. Day after day, P-38 pilots lifted off from Port Moresby into shimmering heat, climbing over endless jungle and empty ocean. Hours passed with nothing but the steady growl of twin Allison engines and sweat pooling beneath flight suits. The Lightning was bigger, heavier than anything they'd flown before. Every takeoff felt like a gamble. Every landing a small victory. Japanese pilots watched from afar and laughed. Rumors spread through their squadrons that the Americans had brought in some kind of heavy reconnaissance aircraft, too slow, too awkward to dogfight. A curiosity, not a threat. Certainly not something to fear. That illusion died on the morning of December 27, 1942. 12 P-38s climbed high above the clouds unseen. Below them, Japanese formations moved with confidence, expecting another familiar hunt. When the Americans rolled inverted and pushed their noses down, the Lightning fell like a weapon released from the sky itself. The dive was violent. Speed built instantly. The airframe screamed as altitude vanished in seconds. Japanese pilots looked up too late, just long enough to see twin boom shadows ripping out of the sun. Zeros tried to react on instinct. They pulled hard into turns. They tried to climb. Both choices were fatal. Those who chased the dive felt their aircraft shake at the edge of destruction. Wings threatened to tear free. Those who tried to climb stalled helplessly, hanging in the air as the Lightnings looped back down with guns already aligned. There was no swirling dogfight, no elegant dance, just precision. One pass, one burst, one enemy falling away in smoke and flame. In less than 10 minutes, the sky was littered with burning wreckage. Japanese pilots who survived fled in disbelief, radios filled with frantic warnings about a fighter that could not be caught and could not be escaped. On the American side, there was no cheering, no celebration, only silence. The lightning had proven itself, and every man in those cockpits understood the truth. In his bones, the rules of survival had changed. From this moment forward, the sky belonged to those who climbed higher, struck faster, and never looked back. The Zero's reign wasn't over yet, but it was bleeding. By early 1943, the Lightning was no longer reacting to the war. It was shaping it. The proof came not in isolated dogfights, but in battles where entire campaigns hung in the balance. Japanese bombers still prowled the skies, still searched for weak points, but now every climb was watched, every formation stalked from above by unseen eyes. On January 7th, 9 P-38s lifted off to escort B-25's bombers over New Guinea. The Japanese answered with more than twice that number of fighters. On paper, it should have been a massacre. Instead, the Lightnings climbed higher, far higher than their enemies dared. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin, the sun blinding. Then they dropped. One by one, American fighters fell out of the sky like meteors. Lieutenant Richard Bong came down first, firing a perfect deflection burst that shattered a Japanese fighter in seconds. As others tried to climb after him, they stalled helpless, while the Lightnings arced back upward and struck again. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. Word spread fast. Japanese pilots now knew the truth: they could not force the Lightning into a fight on their terms. Every engagement belonged to the Americans. 2 months later, that advantage decided a campaign. In March 1943, Japanese transports raced toward New Guinea, carrying troops and supplies meant to save a collapsing front. Allied bombers moved in low and slow, exactly the kind of targets the Zero had once destroyed with ease. But this time, the sky above them was already taken. P-38s swept down in vertical attacks, tearing apart Japanese escorts before they could reach the bombers. With the air cleared, Allied aircraft turned the sea into an inferno. Transports burned, destroyers sank. An entire reinforcement effort vanished beneath the waves. Without air control, Japan's position in New Guinea began to crumble. The Lightning had crossed a line. It was no longer just protecting bombers. It was deciding who lived, who moved, and who advanced. The Zero, once the unquestioned ruler of the Pacific, was being pushed back, altitude by altitude, victory by victory. And the men flying the Lightning understood something now with absolute clarity. The sky wasn't contested anymore. It was being taken. With the sky increasingly under American control, the Lightning began doing something no fighter had ever done in the Pacific before. It reached too far. Japanese commanders still believed there were limits, distances the Americans could not cross, leaders who were safe once they left the front. That illusion shattered in April 1943. Codebreakers uncovered a prize beyond imagination: the exact flight plan of Japan's most important commander. The mission to intercept him demanded absolute precision, hundreds of miles over open ocean. No radio calls, no margin for error. A single mistake meant disappearance into the sea. Only one aircraft could attempt it. At dawn, a small formation of P-38s lifted off and dropped to wave-top height engines, whispering just above the water. For hours, they flew by, dead reckoning alone every minute, ticking closer to either triumph or oblivion. When the clock reached the intercept point, 2 enemy bombers appeared exactly where predicted. The attack was sudden, violent, final. In seconds, concentrated fire ripped into the lead aircraft. It fell into the jungle below, taking with it the architect of Pearl Harbor. The shockwave of that moment rippled across the Pacific. Japanese pilots understood what it meant immediately. No one was untouchable anymore. As 1943 war on the Lightning multiplied across the theater, new squadrons arrived. New aces emerged. Richard Bong climbed relentlessly toward legend. Thomas Maguire matched him with aggression and innovation. Their tactics, high speed, yo-yos, barrel rolls, vertical traps became doctrine almost overnight. Japanese responses grew desperate. Orders warned pilots to avoid P-38s above 15,000 feet. Engagements were to be brief, evasive, and only when numbers overwhelmingly favored Japan. The Zero, once the hunter, was now instructed to flee. Daylight operations began to vanish. Ships moved only at night. Supplies crept forward under darkness. The empire that had surged across the Pacific was now shrinking beneath an invisible ceiling of altitude it could not break. For American pilots, the Lightning brought something just as powerful as victory: confidence. They no longer entered the sky hoping to survive. They entered knowing they controlled it. Each climb was deliberate, each dive calculated. The fear that once ruled the cockpit was replaced by discipline, and discipline became dominance. The Pacific Air War had crossed a point of no return. What remained was not whether the Lightning would win the sky, but how completely it would break the enemy who once owned it. By late 1943, the damage was no longer hidden. It was catastrophic. Japanese air groups that once returned from missions in triumph were now coming back shattered or not at all. Units that had entered the year with dozens of veteran pilots were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Entire squadrons were withdrawn after losing most of their aircraft in weeks. The losses weren't just numerical, they were irreplaceable. The men who had mastered the Zero in the early war were gone. In their place came pilots with barely 100 flight hours. Young men rushed through shortened training pipelines, many of whom had never flown above 20,000 feet. They were sent straight into a sky ruled by experienced Americans, flying faster, higher, and with brutal precision. Against the Lightning, they didn't stand a chance. Industrial reality sealed their fate. Japan struggled with shortages of aluminum fuel and engines. New aircraft arrived too slowly in numbers too small to matter. Meanwhile, American factories worked without pause. Damaged Lightnings were repaired and flown again. Lost aircraft were replaced almost immediately. By the end of 1943, thousands of P-38s were in service, their presence stretching from New Guinea to the Solomons and beyond. The psychological impact cut even deeper. Captured letters and reports spoke of fear of twin-boom fighters diving from unreachable heights of firing bursts that fell short as the enemy simply climbed away. Some Japanese pilots requested transfers to ground units rather than face the Lightning again. For a warrior culture built on aggression and honor, being forced into avoidance was humiliation layered atop defeat. Daylight vanished from Japanese operations. Convoys moved only at night. Bases were resupplied by submarine or desperate destroyer dashes under cover of darkness. Airfields that once buzzed with confidence now waited in silence, knowing that any movement after sunrise could summon death from above. For the Allies, the transformation was just as profound. Air superiority, once a distant dream, was now a reality. Reconnaissance aircraft flew freely. Bombers struck targets that had been untouchable a year earlier. Ground offensives advanced under a protective umbrella the Japanese could no longer pierce. The Lightning had done more than win dogfights. It had broken the enemy's ability to fight. The Zero, once a legend whispered with fear, was now a relic still dangerous in skilled hands, but no longer king of the sky. The balance of the Pacific War had shifted decisively, and there was no path back. From this point on, the question was no longer who controlled the air. It was how far that control would carry the war forward. By the time the Pacific War pushed into 1944, the outcome in the air was no longer in doubt. The old battles were gone, the swirling, desperate turning fights that had once defined the early months of the war. In their place stood a new reality. Altitude, speed, and control decided everything. And that reality bore the unmistakable signature of the Lightning. Between late 1942 and early 1945, P-38 squadrons claimed more than 1,500 confirmed victories in the Southwest Pacific, losing only a fraction of that number in return. But numbers alone could not explain what had changed. The true victory was psychological. American pilots flew with confidence for the first time. Not reckless confidence, but earned confidence. They knew the rules. They trusted their machines. They climbed higher, waited longer, struck harder. Fear no longer dictated their actions. Discipline did. For Japanese pilots, the transformation was devastating. The sky that had once felt like home became hostile territory. Every climb carried dread. Every glint of metal above the clouds threatened annihilation. The twin-boom silhouette diving from the sun became a symbol of inevitability. The war was no longer about skill alone. It was about facing an enemy that refused to fight the old way. The Lightning's influence didn't end with the war. Its philosophy reshaped air combat forever. Post-war fighters carried its lessons into the jet age. Energy management, overturning ability, altitude as dominance, firepower concentrated and decisive. From Korea to the Cold War, sky's echoes of the P-38 lived on in every high-speed climb and vertical engagement. And for the men who flew it, the Lightning was never just an aircraft. It was survival over endless ocean. It was confidence in the dive. It was the promise of coming home even on one engine. Today, restored P-38s still fly, their engines thundering across air shows, their twin tails gleaming in the sun. In jungles and lagoons, across the Pacific, wrecks still rest where they fell silent, reminders of a moment when the future of the war was decided above the clouds. The Zero entered history as a legend. The Lightning ended that legend, and in doing so, it proved a timeless truth of war. Victory belongs not to tradition, but to those who adapt, climb higher, and strike first. When the Pacific War finally drew toward its end, the Lightning was already part of legend. Not because it was perfect, not because it was beautiful, but because it arrived at the moment when failure was no longer an option and changed everything. The P-38 did not win the war alone. Ships, soldiers, bombers, and sacrifice carried the fight across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. But none of it could have happened without control of the sky. And it was the Lightning that helped tear that control from Japan's grasp. What began as a strange silhouette under camouflage nets became the blade that cut the heart out of Japanese air power. It broke the Zero's myth. It shattered an entire doctrine built on turning fights and elite pilots. It forced an empire onto the defensive, robbed it of daylight, and exposed its fleets, bases and leaders to attack. More than victories, the Lightning delivered momentum. With air superiority secured, Allied ground forces advanced. Supply lines flowed. Campaigns once considered impossible became inevitable. The war stopped being a desperate struggle for survival and became a relentless push forward. And long after the guns fell silent, the Lightning's influence endured. Its lessons shaped a new age of air combat, one where speed, altitude, and energy ruled, where discipline mattered more than bravado, where the sky became a three-dimensional battlefield instead of a flat arena of chance. From the jet fighters of Korea to the supersonic machines of the modern era, the Lightning's philosophy lived on. For the men who flew it, the legacy was simpler and more personal. It was the aircraft that gave them a fighting chance, the machine that brought them home across endless water, the reason fear no longer owned the cockpit. Today, when restored P-38s thunder across the sky, they carry more than engines and metal. They carry the memory of a moment when the balance of a war tipped on altitude, speed, and courage. The Zero began the Pacific War as a legend. The Lightning ended it, and in that crack of thunder from above the world learned a hard truth. In war, survival belongs not to those who cling to tradition, but to those who dare to climb higher, think faster, and strike first. The lesson written in the sky. The story of the Lightning does not end with victory parades or silent runways. It lingers in the lesson it left behind. In the early days of the Pacific War, Japan had everything tradition could offer: elite pilots, proven tactics, unquestioned confidence. And for a time, it was enough. The Zero ruled because it represented the peak of an older way of thinking: skill over systems, turning fights over energy, bravery over adaptation. The Lightning shattered that illusion. It proved that courage alone is never enough, that legends, no matter how feared, can be broken, and that war does not reward those who fight best by yesterday's rules, but those who rewrite them. For American airmen, the P-38 marked a transformation of identity. They were no longer reacting, no longer surviving by inches. They became planners, hunters, masters of space and time. Altitude was no longer just sky, it was advantage. Speed was not escape, it was control. The battlefield expanded upward, and with it the future of air combat. For Japan, the lesson was brutal and unforgiving. Once the Lightning took the heights, there was no recovery. Industry could not catch up. Training could not replace experience. Doctrine could not evolve fast enough. The empire that had once surged forward with confidence found itself shrinking beneath a ceiling it could no longer break. That pattern would repeat throughout history. Again and again, wars would be decided not by who fought harder, but by who adapted faster. From jets over Korea to modern air combat, today, the same truth endures: dominance belongs to those who seize the third dimension and never surrender it. The Lightning was not just an aircraft of World War II, it was a warning. A warning that superiority is temporary, that tradition can become a trap, that the sky favors innovation, discipline, and those willing to abandon pride. High above the Pacific, in a time when the outcome of a global war still hung in the balance, a twin-boom fighter wrote that warning in fire and altitude. And long after the echoes of its engines faded, the message remained etched into the very nature of modern warfare. The sky had changed forever. Even today, the lightning has not fallen silent. Across quiet airfields and museum hangars, its twin booms still cast long shadows. Restored P-38 thunder into the sky at air shows, engines roaring with the same raw power that once shook the jungles of New Guinea. For spectators, it's history in motion. For those who know its story, it's something more, a reminder of the moment the sky itself changed sides. On distant Pacific islands, the war has never fully ended. Wrecked aircraft lie half buried in jungle vines or resting beneath clear blue water, aluminum skin corroded by time. Some are zeros, some are lightnings. Each one marks a place where fear, skill, and fate collided in seconds that decided lives and sometimes entire campaigns. What the lightning represents is larger than victory. It represents the moment when innovation defeated arrogance, when discipline overcame instinct, when altitude became power and power became control. The P-38 did not ask pilots to be fearless. It asked them to be patient, to think, to wait, to strike only when the odds were theirs. In doing so, it transformed young men, farm boys, mechanics, students into masters of a new battlefield. The Zero had once terrified the Pacific. Its pilots were legends, its reputation unchallenged. But legends are fragile. All it took was one machine that refused to turn, one doctrine that climbed higher, and one generation willing to let go of the past. That is the true legacy of the Lightning. Not just that it won battles, but that it proved how wars are really won. Not by clinging to what once worked, not by trusting reputation or pride, but by adapting faster than the enemy can react. High above the clouds in dives that split the sky open, the P-38 wrote that lesson in fire. And every modern fighter that climbs into thin air carries its echo. The thunder may have faded, but its warning still rolls across the sky. In the end, the Lightning did more than win control of the sky. It took the crown. What began as desperation, an answer to defeat and humiliation, became dominance forged by discipline and innovation. The P-38 Lightning did not chase glory. It hunted advantage. It climbed higher, waited longer, and struck with certainty. And in doing so, it ended an era. By the final years of the war, the Zero was no longer the symbol pilots whispered about in fear. It was still dangerous, still deadly in skilled hands, but it was no longer decisive. The balance had shifted permanently. Japanese air power, once bold and aggressive, was reduced to fragments, short on fuel, short on pilots, short on hope. The Lightning had done what no aircraft alone was supposed to do. It broke a myth. It proved that air superiority is not inherited. It is earned moment by moment by those who adapt faster than history expects. It showed that war in the sky would never again be about flat circles and tight turns, but about energy, altitude, and control of time itself. For the men who flew it, the war ended quietly. They climbed out of cockpits, handed in flight helmets, and returned to lives that could never fully understand what they had seen from 30,000 feet. But the Lightning never left them. It was there in the memory of dives that felt endless, in the sound of engines bringing them home across black water, in the certainty that discipline had kept them alive. History would remember names, aces, battles, victories. But above all, it would remember the shift. The moment the sky stopped being a gamble and became a weapon. The P-38 Lightning entered the war as an outsider, strange, doubted, unconventional. It left as a standard by which modern air combat would be measured, not because it was flawless, but because it changed the rules when the old ones meant death. And that is why decades later, its story still matters. Because somewhere above the clouds, every time a fighter climbs for advantage instead of turning for pride, the Lightning's legacy is still alive. The crown of the Pacific sky was never handed over. It was taken in thunder steel and altitude. The night the Lightning refused to let him die, the mission was already over. No enemy in sight, no gunfire, just empty sky and a long flight home over black water. The kind of mission pilots hated, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt safe. That's when the engine exploded. The Wright Allison died in a flash of fire and oil, the Lightning yawing violently as alarms screamed inside the cockpit. The propeller windmilled uselessly, shaking the entire airframe. Below him, nothing but darkness. Hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, no ships, no lights, no second chances. In a single-engine fighter, this would have been the end. But this wasn't a single-engine fighter. The pilot cut fuel, feathered the prop, and fought the instinct to panic. The Lightning dipped hard, losing altitude fast. One engine meant drag. Drag meant death if he lost speed. Sweat poured into his eyes as he shoved the throttle forward on the remaining engine past limits he'd been told never to cross. The aircraft shuddered, then steadied. The P-38 held. Hour after hour, the pilot flew alone in the dark, listening to every vibration, every change in pitch, knowing that if the second engine failed, there would be no warning, just silence, then water. He imagined the cockpit filling, the canopy sinking, sharks circling below. But the Lightning kept flying. At dawn, the coastline finally appeared like a mirage. The pilot was exhausted, dehydrated, barely conscious. Landing on one engine was never guaranteed, especially on a rough Pacific strip. Ground crews watched in silence as the damaged fighter limped in, dropped its gear, and slammed onto the runway, skidding, bouncing, but staying upright. When the engine finally shut down, the pilot didn't climb out. He just sat there, hands shaking, staring at the instrument panel. Later mechanics counted the damage. Shrapnel holes, a ruined engine, fuel lines shredded. Any other fighter would have gone into the sea within minutes. The Lightning had brought him home. That day, no enemy aircraft was shot down, no victory was claimed, no headlines were written. But one pilot lived. And from that moment on, word spread quietly through the squadrons. The P-38 wasn't just how you killed the enemy. It was how you survived the Pacific. By late 1943, American pilots believed they understood the Lightning. They knew how it fought, how it climbed, how it killed. Most of all, they believed they knew how it saved lives. After months of victories, the P-38 felt predictable, powerful, reliable, almost invincible. Then one night, a Lightning didn't come home. There was no mayday call, no frantic radio chatter, no report of enemy contact. One moment the aircraft was flying a routine escort mission deep over the Pacific engines, steady fuel, normal pilot, calm. The next moment, it simply vanished. The ocean swallowed thousands of planes during the war, so at first no one panicked. Mechanical failure, commanders said. A navigation error. Another silent loss in an unforgiving theater. But when intelligence officers reviewed the radio logs, something didn't add up. The last transmission wasn't tense or rushed. It was casual, almost relaxed. The pilot hadn't known he was in danger, and that made the silence that followed far more disturbing. Days later, an unsettling report surfaced. Japanese listening stations picked up a distorted Allied transmission, English broken, repeating the same phrase again and again. The signal was weak, unstable, coming from a direction where no American aircraft should have been operating. Then it faded into static and disappeared. Search flights found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no parachute. Weeks passed, but among the pilots, the story refused to die. It spread quietly in briefing rooms and tents, shared in low voices after long missions. Some claimed they had seen a lone P-38 flying at dusk far from any formation. Others swore they heard engines echoing over empty water where no aircraft should have been. The lightning, they said, was still out there, trapped between sky and sea. After the war, fragments of truth emerged in declassified reports. Weather fronts that bent navigation, magnetic anomalies that twisted compasses, a coastline that looked familiar but wasn't, a pilot who followed the wrong land at the wrong moment and crossed into enemy territory without ever realizing it. What happened after that was never confirmed. There was no crash site, no prisoner record, no grave. Only the unanswered space where a man and his aircraft had been.